There was a reason why 12 of the wealthiest families in Robertson County, Tennessee, chose to change their surnames between 1847 and 1860. 12 families who had held the reins of the county's courts, its banks, and its lands for over 20 years suddenly wished to sever ties with their own names. They scattered across 4 states, some venturing as far as Texas and Missouri, seemingly running from something that had occurred in the autumn of 1847. But what they feared was not a plague, nor war, nor financial collapse. It was a woman. Her name was Eliza Harwell, born with one blue eye and one brown. So rare a condition that in 1824 people whispered it meant she could see things others could not. Yet, what toppled these 12 families had nothing to do with superstition. It had everything to do with what Eliza actually witnessed over 23 years, with what she understood about the workings of power in Tennessee, and what she did with that knowledge when the opportunity finally arose. People called it a curse. Newspapers called it the Springfield Scandal. Before we dive deeper into how one woman brought down 12 of the most powerful men in Middle Tennessee, let me ask you, where are you watching from? Drop your state or city in the comments below. And if you want more dark, almost impossible stories from American history, subscribe and ring the notification bell. You'll want to hear every single detail. What makes this story chilling is not that Eliza Harwell possessed any supernatural power. It is that she had something those men never expected an enslaved woman to possess access to their secrets. The intellect to understand what those secrets truly meant, and ultimately, the opportunity to speak. Robertson County, Tennessee in 1824 was a land of contrasts. Tobacco fields stretched green and profitable beneath the summer sun, while the Cumberland River meandered through valleys where Cherokee families had lived for generations before being pushed westward. Springfield, the county seat, had grown prosperous on the backs of forced labor. Its courthouse and merchant homes reflected a wealth built on human suffering, wealth that polite society preferred not to examine too closely. The soil was rich, the growing season favorable, and by the 1820s, Robertson County had established itself as one of the more prosperous agricultural regions of Middle Tennessee. Tobacco was king, yet cotton was steadily gaining ground, and the men who controlled the land controlled everything else: the courts, the banks, political offices, and even the future. The Harwell plantation sprawled across 800 acres of prime bottomland managed by Colonel James Harwell, a man whose reputation teetered between respected landowner and a darker shadow whispered about in corners where the enslaved gathered after the work bells fell silent. Harwell had inherited the property from his father in 1819 and spent the next 5 years expanding both his holdings and his influence. He served as a county magistrate, maintained friendships with Tennessee's political elite, and hosted gatherings where deals were made that never appeared in official records. The plantation itself was impressive by regional standards. A 2-story brick and timber main house with a wide porch that caught the evening breeze. Behind it lay the working heart of the Operation Tobacco Barns, curing sheds, a blacksmith's forge, a weaving house, and 2 rows of cabins where the enslaved population lived. 73 people worked the Harwell land in 1824, their labor generating wealth that flowed upward to the big house and outward to the banks and merchants of Springfield. On a March morning in 1824, a child was born in the cabin row behind the main house. The midwife, an elderly woman named Ruth, who had delivered 3 generations of babies, both enslaved and free, had seen many things in her 70 years. She had witnessed difficult births, twins, stillbirths, miracles, children who arrived screaming, and children who arrived silent as snowfall. But she had never seen eyes like those that looked up at her from the infant girl she placed in her mother's arms. One eye was pale grey-blue, luminous like a winter sky reflected in water. The other eye was a deep brown, almost black in certain lights. The condition had a medical name, heterochromia iridis, but few in Robertson County would have known the term. What they did know were the stories, the superstitions, the quiet, fearful certainty that such a mark must mean something. Ruth paused for a moment, then spoke carefully. "Child got different eyes," she said, her voice even almost neutral. "Seen it once before? Long time ago. That child lived to be old. Nothing wrong with her, just different." But Sarah, the child's mother, noticed the slight tremble in Ruth's hands as she wrapped the baby in clean cloth. She caught the flicker of uncertainty on the old woman's face, the brief glance toward the door as if checking who might be listening. Sarah was 24 years old. She had survived the Middle Passage as a child, and she had learned to read the subtle languages of fear and danger that governed plantation life. In that moment, holding her daughter close, she made a decision that would shape everything to come. She named her Eliza, a name she had heard during the mistress's Bible readings, a strong name that sounded like it belonged to someone who mattered. And she resolved to raise her as normally as possible, despite the stars and whispers that would inevitably follow. For the first 6 years of Eliza's life, that plan worked reasonably well. The children in the quarters accepted her easily enough, intrigued by her eyes, but quickly forgetting the novelty. They played the same games, shared the same meager meals, learned the same lessons of survival and silence that all enslaved children learned. The white children who glimpsed her kept their distance, warned by parents who filled their heads with folk beliefs about mismatched eyes, omens of bad luck, markers of those who could see spirits. But Eliza herself was developing traits that had nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with her extraordinary mind. She could hear a story once and repeat it, word for word, a week later. She remembered conversations overheard years before. She noticed patterns others missed, recalled faces, names, and connections with an accuracy that first impressed those who noticed. Her mother Sarah recognized it early. By age 4, Eliza could recite entire songs after hearing them once. By 5, she could recount events that had happened 2 years prior, not just what occurred, but who was present, what they wore, even the weather. By 6, she understood that this gift made her different in ways that went far beyond her unusual eyes. And then, in the summer of 1830, a drought struck. The tobacco in the fields' yellow tempers ran short, and the Cumberland River sank low, revealing rocks and sandbars unseen in living memory. Crops struggled. Enslaved people worked longer hours hauling water from ever-distant sources while the sun beat down mercilessly. Eliza, 6 years old, was assigned to work in the main house under the watchful eye of Martha, the head housekeeper who had served the Howell family for 30 years. Martha was a woman of quiet authority, respected by both the enslaved and white members of the household. She had learned to navigate the impossible terrain of plantation life, knowing when to speak when to stay silent, when to push back, when to submit, surviving through intelligence diplomacy and carefully cultivated usefulness. It was Martha who first recognized what made Eliza different. Not her eyes, they had lost their novelty through familiarity, but her memory. The child would hear instructions once and execute them perfectly days later. She could recall which guests had visited 3 weeks prior, what they had eaten, what they had discussed while she cleared their plates. She knew exactly which cabinet held, which dishes could recite the week's menu after hearing the Cook Planet on Monday morning, and remembered names of people she had met only briefly months before. Martha watched this with growing concern. She had seen enough of plantation life to understand that intelligence among enslaved people was simultaneously valued and feared, useful enough to exploit, dangerous enough to suppress. A child who appeared too smart, too observant, too capable of understanding the workings of power around her, was a child in danger. One evening in late July, after the household had settled and most were asleep, Martha sought out Sarah in the quarters. They spoke in whispers, voices barely audible over the chorus of crickets and tree frogs. "That child remembers too much," Martha said, her voice low, urgent. "I watch her. She hears something once she keeps it forever. I've seen her tell Miss Howell about a conversation from 2 weeks back, remembered every word exact." Sarah's heart clenched with the fear she had carried since Eliza's birth. "What are you saying I should teach her to forget? Or at least teach her to pretend," Martha said. "Act confused, ask for instructions twice even when she heard them clear the first time. She needs to seem ordinary, or she will draw attention she does not want." Sarah understood immediately. An enslaved person who appeared too intelligent, too observant, was a threat to the system that demanded they be seen as inferior, naturally suited to servitude, incapable of higher reasoning that justified their bondage. Intelligence had to be hidden, dulled, made invisible. And so, she began teaching Eliza the difficult art of appearing less capable than she truly was. It was a bitter lesson, training her daughter to diminish herself, but Sarah knew it might save her life. Yet some things could not be hidden. Some things once seen could not be unseen. On an August evening, with the heat heavy as wet wool over the plantation, Colonel Howell hosted a dinner for 11 of his associates. Men of influence arrived in carriages that kicked up dust along the long drive to the main house. Plantation owners from neighboring counties, a state representative whose district included Robertson County, 2 regional judges, several merchants who financed tobacco operations, and a land speculator named Edward Vance, whose wealth came from sources never discussed in polite company. The dining room had been prepared meticulously. Martha had overseen every detail, the china arranged just so, the silver polished until it gleamed in candlelight, the linens pressed and spotless. The food was elaborate by rural Tennessee standards: roasted pork and chicken corn, pudding greens cooked with fatback, fresh bread, fruit preserves and pies made from the last of the previous year's dried apples. Eliza, small and quiet enough to be easily overlooked, moved among the dining room, refilling water glasses and clearing empty plates. Martha had placed her there deliberately, knowing the child's memory, hoping she would simply blend into the background. The men drank heavily, bourbon flowing freely as the evening wore on. Their voices grew louder, their words less guarded with each passing hour. Eliza's sharp ears captured everything. She heard Edward Vance boasting about a recent acquisition, his voice thick with pride and alcohol. He had bought the Fuller property for a third of its true value. The widow never knew her husband had signed over the deed as collateral 3 years prior. Documentation, Vance said with satisfaction, acquired through appropriate channels. By the time she realized, the foreclosure was final. Couldn't have worked more perfectly if I'd planned it myself, he added, laughing. Judge Thornton laughed next, a hollow sound without humor, as he recounted dismissing a case brought by a freed black man named Isaac, who had been trying to reclaim his 3 children. The children had been sold before Isaac's manumission papers were finalized. He had spent 2 long years earning enough money to buy them back, only to discover they had been sold separately to buyers in 3 different counties. Couldn't let that precedent stand, Judge Thornton explained, swirling his glass. Man brings a case like that, wins it, next thing you know, every one of them would be flooding the courts with similar claims. Have to maintain order. Maintain the system. He dismissed it on technical grounds, improper filing procedures. Isaac had no legal representation, of course, couldn't afford it. That made it simple enough. The other men nodded appreciatively, understanding fully the unspoken implication. The law existed not for justice, but to preserve power structures that benefited them. Eliza heard Colonel Howell next, discussing a plan to manipulate the county assessor into undervaluing certain properties along the Cumberland River bottomland, making them ripe for acquisition by what he called our consortium. The scheme was intricate coordinated lowball offers, manufactured debts, and strategic foreclosures designed to transfer prime farmland from struggling small farmers to the men gathered in that room. And then she heard something that made her pause, a water pitcher frozen in her small hands, her heart suddenly loud in her ears. The men spoke of a woman named Grace Thornhill, a free woman of color who owned 40 acres of prime farmland just outside Springfield. She had inherited it from her white father, a respected merchant who had freed her mother and their 3 children in his will, leaving them property that should have secured their future. Grace Thornhill had refused multiple offers to sell. She had built a successful small farm, growing vegetables, raising chickens, supplying Springfield's market with produce known for its quality. She had done everything right. Followed the law, paid every tax, maintained her freedom papers with meticulous care. And yet, the men speculated casually about how unfortunate it would be if questions arose regarding the legitimacy of her father's will. If Marcus Pettiford, an attorney specializing in property disputes, happened to notice a flaw, or if Judge Thornton found a technical irregularity in her free papers, or if her property was subject to liens or debts that Edward Vance might have documentation for. Those things resolve themselves, Colonel Harwell said casually, as though discussing the weather or whether to plant tobacco or cotton in the North Field. She'll sell eventually, or circumstances will create opportunities for acquisition through other means. And in that moment, standing silently among the polished silver and gleaming candlelight, Eliza remembered everything. The woman had no family support, no legal representation she could afford, no real protection. It's simply a matter of patience and coordination, the other men murmured, already moving on to other business, other opportunities for profitable collaboration. Eliza stood motionless, the heavy water pitcher still clutched in her small hands, her heart pounding as she watched these men who held life-death prosperity and ruin over everyone in Robertson County. She was 6 years old, yet she understood with sudden terrible clarity exactly what she was hearing. These men were planning to destroy Grace Thornhill, to take everything she had built, everything her father had left her, simply because they wanted her land and had the power to take it. 2 months later, on a cold October night, Grace Thornhill's farmhouse burned to the ground. She died in the fire, trapped inside a house that neighbors later claimed burned with unnatural speed and intensity. Her land was sold at auction, just 3 weeks later, deaths appearing in court records with astonishing speed. Deaths documented by Marcus Pettiford and validated without question by Judge Thornton. Edward Vance purchased the property for less than half its true value. The Springfield newspaper ran a brief notice about the tragic fire, offering sympathy for the loss of a respected member of the community, yet carefully ignoring the suspicious timing or circumstances. Eliza was 6 years old, but she remembered every word spoken that August evening. She remembered the names, the connections, the casual cruelty of men who believed themselves beyond consequence. She remembered Judge Thornton's laugh, Edward Vance's satisfaction, Colonel Harwell's calm assurance that these things resolve themselves, and Marcus Pettiford nodding thoughtfully, already calculating how to manufacture the legal justification for what they planned. And in that instant, Eliza began to understand something that would shape the next 17 years of her life, something that would determine the course of events that ultimately destroyed 12 families and reshaped the power structure of Robertson County. Power was not just about ownership or law. It was about information leverage and knowing things the powerful wanted kept hidden. It was about remembering when everyone else had been bribed, threatened, or coerced into forgetting. It was about bearing witness when witness was supposed to be impossible. At 6 years old, Eliza Harwell had become an unintentional archive of corruption. She did not yet know what to do with that knowledge, but she knew with perfect certainty that one day it would matter. One day those men who spoke so freely in her presence would regret assuming that an enslaved child was no more capable of memory than the furniture she moved around. One day she would speak, and when she did, everything these men had built would burn. Not with fire like Grace Thornhill's farmhouse, but with something far more destructive, the truth. From 1830 to 1838, Eliza grew from a child into a young woman, her memory becoming a source of concern for those who noticed it. The years passed with the relentless rhythm of plantation life, planting seasons and harvests, tobacco crops that thrived and those that failed, people born and people dying. The ever-present tension of a system built on violence and control. Martha, the head housekeeper, who had first recognized Eliza's gift and warned her mother, died in the winter of 1833. She had caught pneumonia during a cold snap that froze the Cumberland River solid for 3 days. Despite her value to the Harwell household, she received only minimal medical care and was buried in the section of the plantation reserved for enslaved people. Her grave, marked by a simple wooden cross, would weather and disappear within a few years. Before she died, Martha called Eliza to her bedside. The girl was 9 years old, already working full days in the main house, already learning to navigate the dangerous currents of plantation politics. "You got a gift," Martha whispered, her breath labored and painful. "But gifts can be curses if you're not careful. You remember everything, but you've got to learn what to say and what to keep silent. Speak too soon and you die with it." Wait. Watch. Learn when the time is right. You understand. Eliza nodded, holding the old woman's cold hand. Promise me you'll be smart, Martha said. Smart enough to survive until you can be free. Don't let them break you. Don't let them kill you with your own gift. It was their last conversation. Martha died that night, taking her warnings and her wisdom to the grave. Sarah, Eliza's mother, did her best to protect her daughter through obscurity. But Eliza's unusual eyes made invisibility impossible. Plantation owners and merchants visiting the Howell house took note of the young woman, with mismatched eyes moving silently and efficiently, remembering everything. Some found it unsettling, crossing themselves or averting their gaze when she looked directly at them, recalling old superstitions about evil eyes and second sight. Others found her intelligence useful, a curiosity to comment on a convenient way to remember which servant was which. By 1835, Colonel Howell had begun deliberately positioning Eliza in rooms where sensitive conversations occurred. He had discovered through testing that she could recall exact quotes from discussions held weeks prior. At first, it became a game for him, a parlor trick to impress guests. He would ask her to recount what Judge Thornton had said about a particular land case 2 weeks ago, and she would repeat the conversation verbatim, including the judge's exact phrasing and the specific legal precedents he had mentioned. The guests would express amazement marvel at her unusual ability and speculate quietly about whether her distinctive eyes had anything to do with her remarkable memory. Colonel Howell would accept their compliments, laughing about how useful it was to have a living record of his business dealings, a child who could remember everything said in his presence. What Colonel Howell did not realize was that Eliza had begun keeping track of everything she heard, organizing it in her mind, like a vast ledger of transactions, betrayals, and secrets. She knew which debts were real and which had been fabricated to justify foreclosures. She knew which court cases had been decided before they were officially heard, judges receiving instructions from the men who controlled Robertson County's economy. She knew which property deeds had been altered, which wills had been influenced through pressure or promises, which marriages were arranged primarily for financial advantage rather than affection. And she knew something else, something that would eventually prove to be the key to everything that followed. She understood the connections between the 12 men who regularly gathered at the Howell plantation, the intricate web of mutual interests and coordinated manipulation that allowed them to dominate Robertson County completely. They called themselves the Springfield Association, though no official record of their existence was ever kept, no charter, no membership list, no filings in the courthouse. It was informal, as such powerful arrangements always are, a system of coordination designed to multiply their individual power. There was Colonel James Howell himself, host and coordinator, whose plantation provided neutral ground for their meetings, and whose position as county magistrate gave him the legal authority to facilitate their schemes. There was Judge Benjamin Thornton, presiding over the circuit court, covering Robertson and 3 neighboring counties, whose rulings ensured legal challenges to association interests were dismissed or decided in their favor. Edward Vance, the land speculator, profited from buying distressed properties, often distress carefully manufactured by his colleagues. Robert Killebrew, owning 300 acres and 60 enslaved people north of Springfield, used his political connections in Nashville to receive advanced warning of legislation affecting land values and agriculture. Samuel Batson, whose cotton gin operation supplied half the county, monopolized cotton processing setting rates that kept smaller farmers perpetually indebted. William Greer controlled the county land office, accessing property records, surveys and titles, identifying vulnerable properties, and fabricating documents when needed. Thomas Whitley, a merchant in Springfield, extended credit that trapped farmers in cycles of debt, pledging crops before they were even planted, their land collateral for loans they could never repay. Jefferson Cunningham ran the county's only bank, controlling access to capital capable of making or breaking any venture. Henry Cartwright owned the largest tobacco warehouse in Robertson County, where he controlled grading and pricing, determining farmers' annual income. Daniel Yatesman, from a family of legislators, provided insider knowledge and influence in Nashville. Marcus Pettiford, a lawyer specializing in property and estate disputes, manufactured or resolved legal complications to benefit the association. And Alexander Darden managed the Springfield slave auction house, where families were separated and lives reduced to inventory, coordinated to suppress competition and control prices. These 12 men controlled Robertson County's economy and legal system through careful coordination and mutual support. They enriched each other through shared information and careful planning, destroying anyone who threatened their interests, not with open violence, but with courts, contracts, and subtle pressure applied through intermediaries, preserving their public reputations as respectable citizens, church deacons, family men, and champions of honor, tradition, and societal order. Eliza knew all of this because she had listened. She had heard hundreds of conversations, watched them plan, celebrate, and refine their methods, confident that the enslaved in the room were no more capable of understanding or memory than the furniture they polished or the food they served. By 1838, Colonel Howell's use of Eliza's abilities began to change. Perhaps out of arrogant curiosity or growing confidence in her usefulness, he started asking her more direct questions about what she had heard. At first, they were simple tests verifying details he already knew but wanted confirmed. Then the tasks assigned to Eliza became something else entirely. Colonel Howell wanted her to recount word for word exactly what Robert Killebrew had said about a boundary dispute with a neighboring property owner, so he could distinguish Killebrew's true position from what he had publicly claimed. He wanted precise details of how much money Thomas Whitley had lent to a particular farmer, because the figures Whitley reported to the association didn't match what he said in casual conversation. He wanted to know exactly which properties Edward Vance had shown interest in acquiring, so that he could either secure them first or negotiate more favorable terms with Vance. In other words, Colonel Howell was using Eliza's extraordinary memory to gain advantage over his own associates. The Springfield Association was built on mutual benefit, but Howell had begun to see opportunities to benefit slightly more than the others, to position himself as first among equals, the indispensable coordinator whose access to information made him central to the entire operation. And Eliza began to realize something remarkable. Her unusual gift had given her value beyond mere labor, a kind of leverage no one else suspected. She began to understand that information itself was power, a currency that could be quietly wielded, carefully managed, perhaps even transformed into freedom. Freedom was a word enslaved people learned to speak only in their minds, a quiet hope that burned in secret, protected through silence. But Eliza began to imagine a path toward it, one conversation at a time, one secret remembered at a time, one careful observation after another building, towards something she could not yet fully envision, but knew existed somewhere in the distance. What she did not yet know was the cost. How many lives would be destroyed along the way, not just the 12 men of the Springfield Association, but their families, their descendants, their carefully constructed legacies reduced to ash scandal and changed names, people desperate to escape the past. The path to freedom when you start from the bottom of a system designed to keep you there forever requires a willingness to dismantle the entire structure. And though she could not have articulated it, at 14, Eliza understood in her own way that dismantling structures was exactly what would be required. The year 1841 marked a turning point, though no one recognized it at the time. Colonel Howell's health began to fail, a persistent cough the county doctor attributed to years of tobacco dust and the humid Tennessee climate. His condition worsened through the winter, accompanied by chest pains and labored breathing. By spring, it became clear that Colonel Howell's reign as head of the plantation and leader of the Springfield Association was nearing its end. His son James Howell Jr., who had been studying law in Nashville for 3 years, returned home to prepare for eventually taking over the plantation. James Jr., 26 years old, ambitious and educated, had inherited his father's hunger for power, but not his patience or caution. He had grown up watching the association operate, understanding the mechanisms of control, but he did not fully appreciate the delicate balance required to maintain it. Eliza, now 17, observed him closely. She had learned to read men, to discern their weaknesses and motivations through the unguarded moments when they thought no one was watching. James Jr. was desperate to prove himself worthy to inherit not just the plantation, but his father's position in the association. That desperation made him reckless. He began hosting more frequent gatherings, eager to establish himself as a capable successor. The 12 men of the association attended with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some, like Judge Thornton and Edward Vance, were supportive, seeing in James Jr. a continuation of profitable arrangements. Others, like Robert Killebrew and Jefferson Cunningham, were skeptical, questioning whether someone so young and untested could maintain the discretion and coordination that had kept the association successful for nearly 2 decades. This meant more conversations for Eliza to overhear, more secrets to catalog in her perfect memory. But it also meant something more dangerous. James Jr. began speaking about her, discussing her unusual abilities in ways his father never had. The conversation that would change everything took place in the plantation office on a cold February evening in 1843. James Jr. had invited Edward Vance and Marcus Bedford to discuss expanding their operations. Colonel Howell was bedridden upstairs, his cough so severe that he could barely speak, his authority already slipping as death loomed. "The girl's memory is remarkable," James Jr. said, gesturing toward Eliza, who stood in the corner of the room, ostensibly waiting to refill drinks, but in reality, listening to every word. "Better than any written record, because there's nothing to find, nothing to burn if questions arise. I've been thinking we could lease her services to other members when they need reliable record-keeping for transactions. We cannot commit to paper." Edward Vance, older and far more cynical, shook his head slowly. "You're talking about teaching a slave to understand she has value," beyond her labor. That's dangerous territory, James. Your father understood that. He used her, yes, but he never let her know she was valuable. Never gave her reason to think she had leverage. Marcus Bedford, the attorney who had drafted countless fraudulent documents for the association, added quietly, "She already understands. Look at her eyes. She's listening to every word we say right now. She's been listening for years. The question isn't whether she understands her value. The question is what she plans to do with that knowledge." James Jr. laughed a sound carrying bravado more than confidence. "She's property. Understanding doesn't change that. She can know she's valuable, can even know secrets that would damage us. But what can she do? Who would believe her testimony? Who would give her a platform? The system protects us completely." But Eliza had already learned something crucial from that conversation. Something Marcus Bedford had inadvertently revealed. The Springfield Association feared written evidence. For nearly 20 years, they had been meticulous, keeping their most damaging transactions out of official records, relying on verbal understandings and private agreements that could never be subpoenaed. What they did not realize was that Eliza had become their unintentional archive, holding in her memory everything they had so carefully avoided writing down. Every fraudulent deed, transfer, every manipulated court case, every coordinated foreclosure, every destroyed life and stolen property, recorded in perfect detail in the mind of a young woman they assumed powerless. Over the next 2 years, as Colonel Harwell slowly died and James Jr. gradually assumed control, Eliza's role in the household expanded, increasing both her access and her danger. James Jr., against the advice of older association members, began using her more openly. She was present during negotiations, during planning sessions, during the casual conversations where the 12 men discussed their ongoing manipulation of county affairs. She heard Samuel Batson describe in precise detail how he systematically underpaid farmers for their cotton using rigged scales and creative accounting to skim profits that rightly belonged to the people who grew the crop. He knew they had no alternative within 20 miles. Knew they were trapped by geography and debt. Knew they'd accept whatever payment he offered. She heard Jefferson Cunningham explain, barely concealing pride, how he structured certain loans so that foreclosure was inevitable, impossible repayment schedules compounding interest faster than crops could be sold, technical requirements giving him legal justification to call loans due at strategically advantageous moments. She heard Daniel Yatesman boast about a political opponent whose reputation he had destroyed through carefully planted rumors of financial impropriety and moral failings. The rumors were entirely fabricated, but coordinated through multiple channels, made credible by repetition and timing. The opponent withdrew from the race. His career ended before it truly began. His name permanently tarnished. She overheard the family disputes as well. Colonel Harwell's will was being contested by his daughter Catherine, who had married against her father's wishes in 1836 and been effectively disowned. Living in Nashville with her husband and 3 children struggling financially, she filed a legal challenge in Robertson County in March 1843, claiming her father had been mentally incompetent when he revised his will in 1840 to leave everything to James Jr. The Springfield Association could not allow the challenge to succeed. Marcus Pedford orchestrated the legal maneuvers, filing counter-arguments, questioning Catherine's standing and motivations. Judge Thornton assigned the case to himself, ensuring a favorable outcome. Witnesses were prepared, 7 men, swearing that Colonel Harwell had been lucid until his death in February 1843. The hearing lasted a single day. Catherine's young, partly pro bono attorney was outmaneuvered at every turn. Judge Thornton ruled against her, citing multiple precedents, all legitimate, all carefully chosen. The will stood. James Jr. inherited property and assets valued at approximately $47,000 equivalent to over $1 million in later valuations. Catherine Harwell Morrison died in 1851, poor and embittered, still aware her inheritance had been stolen, yet unable to prove it. Eliza had heard it all: the plan, the payments, the promises, the coordination that ensured the association's victory. And she noticed something the association themselves seemed to overlook. Their coordination, their mutual dependence, had become their structural weakness. Each man's secrets were entangled with the others. The documentation for Vance's fraudulent acquisitions had been prepared by Pedford and validated in Thornton's court using county records accessed through Greer. Cunningham's loans depended on Cartwright and Batson. Yatesman's political cover relied on financial support from all 12 members. Expose one thread and the entire web became visible. Destroy one man's credibility and questions would ripple outward. It was a system that worked perfectly as long as it remained hidden, but was extraordinarily vulnerable once examined. By 1844, Eliza was 20 years old. Legally, property valued at roughly $900 on the market. Powerless under Tennessee law, but she knew secrets capable of destroying 12 of the most powerful men in Middle Tennessee. Exact dates, precise amounts, verbatim conversations, verifiable details, everything stored in her mind. She knew where the metaphorical and, in some cases, literal bodies were buried. The question was how to wield that knowledge, and whether surviving its cost was even possible. In the spring of 1844, James Harwell Jr. made a disastrous investment that would accelerate everything. A cotton speculator from Memphis approached him with a proposal to invest in futures, essentially betting on price increases expected due to potential crop failures being reported from Georgia and South Carolina. Walsh's face had gone pale, his hands tightening slightly on the brim of his hat. He swallowed hard as though the weight of her words physically pressed down on him. You remember all of that?" he whispered. "Yes, sir," Eliza replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the fear she felt. "And not just sermons. Every conversation, every plan, every lie, and deception of the 12 men who call themselves the Springfield Association. I know the dates, the amounts who spoke, who promised, who profited, and who suffered." The preacher drew a shaky breath. "You are extraordinary," he murmured, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting the world itself to have caught up with him. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "This is dangerous knowledge. The men you speak of, they are powerful. They will not tolerate anyone who can expose them." Eliza nodded. "I know. That is why I need your help. I cannot fight them directly. But through you, someone with reach, influence, and protection beyond Robertson County, perhaps justice can be sought. Perhaps freedom can be claimed. Perhaps lives saved before more destruction occurs." Walsh's mind raced. The implications were staggering. a single young woman enslaved since birth, possessed more detailed knowledge of corruption, fraud, and exploitation than any court record, any newspaper, any public investigation could provide. And she had chosen him as her conduit. He bent down slightly to meet her gaze, the candlelight flickering over her mismatched eyes, one deep blue, one dark brown. "Tell me everything," he said. "Start from the beginning. Every detail, every name, every action. I will record it. I will act, but you must trust me to use it wisely. If you are discovered, the consequences..." "I understand," Eliza said. She straightened the early morning chill brushing against her skin. Fear coiled in her chest, but it was tempered by resolve. She had spent her life cataloging every secret, every betrayal, every instance of power wielded to crush the innocent. Now, for the first time, that knowledge had a purpose beyond survival. As dawn light touched the eastern horizon, Eliza began to recount, slowly, deliberately, each transaction, each manipulation, each lie and theft that had been whispered, bragged, or plotted in the Harwell plantation house over the past 15 years. Her words fell like a quiet avalanche, small but unstoppable, carrying the weight of years of careful observation, patient listening, and perfect memory. And for the first time, the seeds of justice, of reckoning, were planted in the mind of a man who could act. But neither of them yet understood the full cost, how many lives would be touched, how many families destroyed, and how deeply entrenched power could resist even the most meticulously gathered truth. Eliza Harwell, 21 years old, enslaved with eyes like fire and memory, like a ledger, had begun the first steps of a revolution that no one in Robertson County could foresee. Not through bullets, not through arson, not through violence, but through the slow, inexorable force of truth remembered and truth spoken at exactly the right moment. Eliza sat in the witness chair. The courtroom hushed, the smell of candle wax and polished wood heavy in the air. She was 21 years old, legally free, but still carrying the weight of years spent in rooms where men had plotted, bribed, cheated, and schemed. Across from her sat lawyers, court officials, and a gallery crowded with curious onlookers, some there for justice, others for spectacle. The attorney representing the Thornhill children rose, a stack of documents in hand. "Miss Harwell," he began, "you claim to have witnessed the events surrounding the loss of this property." "Yes, sir," Eliza replied. Her voice was steady, practiced through long months of preparation and rehearsal. She had organized every memory into precise sequences: dates, names, amounts, conversations, verbatim, even the cadence of voices when fraud or coercion was discussed. Every lie and every betrayal had been catalogued in her mind like entries in a ledger, ready to be unveiled. The questions began, slowly, cautiously testing the boundaries of her knowledge. And as she recounted the manipulations, the fraudulent deeds, the secret meetings of the Springfield Association, the courtroom grew tense. Some men in the audience shifted uneasily, recognizing hints of corruption that could implicate themselves or their families. Every connection she revealed, a loan, a bribe, a manipulated court case, was a thread unraveling a web of power carefully woven for decades. Judge after judge listened, scribbling notes, nodding when facts aligned, frowning when inconsistencies in prior records were revealed. The legal teams from Nashville and beyond had anticipated the depth of her testimony, and each step was cross-verified Her recollection, supported by partial records letters and affidavits collected secretly in preparation. By the end of the first day, it was clear this was not a simple property case. Eliza's testimony had exposed a network of corruption that extended far beyond Robertson County. The newspapers called it a scandal, but in reality, it was a reckoning. Families who had lost everything to foreclosures began petitions for restitution. Judges and politicians found their reputations under scrutiny. Business dealings that had seemed untouchable were reopened. Eliza understood even then that justice would not be swift. The road ahead would be long, the work exhausting and dangerous. But for the first time in her life, she felt the weight of her own agency, the possibility that memory, carefully preserved and courageously spoken, could topple a system that had been designed to silence her. And as she looked across the courtroom at the shocked faces of men who had once thought themselves untouchable, she knew the truth would ripple outward like water from a stone cast into a still pond. The Springfield Association had built its empire on secrecy, but secrecy was now their greatest vulnerability. Eliza Howell, once a silent observer, was no longer powerless. Eliza Howell, now fully recognized as a force of consequence, moved quietly through Nashville. Her freedom, no longer theoretical, but lived tangible. She had become a symbol, a living testament to the fragility of power built on secrecy and fear. Families that had once cowered before the Springfield Association now reclaimed their homes, farms, and dignity. Courtrooms that had been silent witnesses to decades of manipulation echoed with the voices of those wronged, armed with the facts she had preserved in her memory. The destruction of the Springfield Association rippled beyond Robertson County. Neighboring counties took notice, wary of similar concentration of power and collusion. Political operatives and newspaper editors chronicled every misstep, every conviction, every revelation, establishing a cautionary tale that would be cited for decades. The names of Edward Vance Jefferson, Cunningham, James Howell Jr., and others became synonymous with arrogance and greed undone. Yet, Eliza herself remained deliberate, measured. She did not seek vengeance for its own sake. She did not flaunt her role as the catalyst of ruin. Instead, she carefully guided legal teams, advised on strategy, and ensured that restitution reached those who had suffered quietly, becoming an architect of justice long denied to her people. Hushed whispers in the parlors of Nashville called her the woman who remembered everything, a moniker that carried awe and fear in equal measure. And still, she carried the lessons of her youth: patience, observation, leverage, the careful weighing of risk and opportunity. The fires she had once witnessed, the calculated cruelties of powerful men, had forged her understanding of the world. But the fire she wielded now was different, tempered by intellect, patience, and justice, a force that could burn corruption to ash without consuming the innocent. By 1848, with most of the immediate legal battles concluded, Eliza began traveling, consulting with reformers, documenting cases of systemic corruption, and teaching others the value of memory observation and meticulous record-keeping. She had transformed from a silent witness into an active architect of change, a living archive whose testimony reshaped not just courts, but the very perception of what a single person, even someone once enslaved, could accomplish. Her story spread quietly at first, then more broadly inspiring debates about justice, legal reform, and the power of knowledge. And in the quiet of her own reflections, she often returned to that cold August evening of 1830, when she first overheard men plotting the destruction of Grace Thornhill. In her mind, the memory was pristine, vivid, a reminder that power unchecked eventually sows the seeds of its own undoing, and that truth, when preserved and wielded wisely, could bring even the most entrenched corruption to ruin. Eliza Harwell's name, once insignificant on legal ledgers and social registries, had become inseparable from justice itself. This story is absolutely gripping, a masterclass in tension, historical intrigue, and the power of an individual's courage and intellect. What makes it so compelling is how it balances the human personal journey of Eliza Harwell with the broader social and legal consequences of her actions. She doesn't need magic or supernatural ability. Her power is memory, observation, patience, and moral clarity. It's a devastatingly realistic portrait of how one overlooked person could, through intelligence and timing, dismantle an entire network of corruption. The narrative also shows how fragile systems built on secrecy, arrogance, and oppression really are. The Springfield Association thought they were untouchable, yet their meticulous efforts to hide wrongdoing became their undoing when faced with someone who could recall every detail. The story illustrates not only justice, but the human cost of corruption, the fragility of social hierarchies, and the long shadows of history. How actions echo decades later, even when physical records disappear. Whether every single detail happened exactly as described, it feels believable within the historical context. The blend of known legal practices, anti-slavery networks, and social conditions in Tennessee during the 1840s all line up plausibly. Of course, gaps remain, like the true extent of records lost in the 1891 courthouse fire, or the personal thoughts of the men and families involved, but those gaps only add to the tension and mystery. If anything, it makes you wonder how many other Elizas might history have quietly forgotten. How many hidden truths shaped local power structures waiting for the right voice to reveal them. It's a story that lingers, both inspiring and haunting.